Good evening, everyone. Good evening, students, faculty, friends. I'm Darnell Hunt, Director of the Ralph Bunche Center for African American Studies and Professor of Sociology here at UCLA. I'm pleased, on the behalf of the Bunche Center faculty and staff, to welcome you to the 21st Thurgood Marshall Lecture. This year we honor Dr. Harry Edwards, a leading voice on the plight of the black athlete and on the interconnections between sport, education, and black liberation. We are particularly excited to have him deliver the Thurgood Marshall Lecture during the Bunche Center's 40th anniversary year, an occasion that prompts us to look back to the social movements of the 1960s that gave birth to black studies. Professor Edwards was an iconic figure in those movements, and he has continued over the years to connect the dots between athletics and racism in America. His voice now may be needed more than ever, and I'm sure after you hear him speak tonight, you'll know why if you already know. Tonight, April 29th, also marks another important occasion, the 18th anniversary of the start of the 1992 Los Angeles uprisings, events that nakedly exposed festering problems of race and economy in America. Now, before we move on with the program tonight, there are a few people I'd like to acknowledge. First of all, the Bunche Center Faculty Advisory Committee. Could you please stand if you're here, members? The Bunche Center Community Advisory Board. Members, please stand. The Bunche Center Student Advisory Board. Members? Okay, we don't have members yet. Anyway, there are lots of students on the Bunche Center Student Advisory Board. Yanina Montero, Vice Chancellor, UCLA Office of Student Affairs. I don't know if I've seen Yanina this evening, but she's been a long-time supporter of the Thurgood Marshall event. Charles Alexander, Associate Vice Provost for Student Diversity. And of course, I'm honored to have here this evening several former Bunche Center directors. First, we have Professor Robert Singleton, the very first director of the Bunche Center, served from 1969 to 1970. Vice Chancellor Claudia Mitchell-Kernan. Associate Dean M. Belinda Tucker. And I don't believe I've seen Richard Yarborough, but I know he's been around, so he may join us at some point this evening. I'd also like to acknowledge Jeanette Moore, who's been a very generous supporter of the Bunche Center over the years. Ms. Jeanette Moore. And last but not certainly not least, Dr. Derek Marshall, nephew of Supreme Court Justice Thurgood Marshall, and also a supporter of the Bunche Center. Now, of course, this evening's event would not be possible without the generous support of our sponsor, Fox Entertainment. I don't believe I've seen Ron Taylor in the building, but he also may be joining us at some point. But thanks to Fox Entertainment and Ron Taylor. Now, before we move on to Dr. Edwards' lecture, I'd like to show you a brief video about a major research project at the Bunche Center that recently culminated this year, our 40th anniversary, after 8 years of collaboration. The Black Los Angeles Project involved dozens and dozens of stakeholders, scholars in the academy, as well as folks in the community who came together to identify the questions and methods for studying black life in the region. The result? The edited volume, Black Los Angeles, American Dreams and Racial Realities, was released last week by NYU Press. It includes 16 chapters written by 25 different scholars from throughout the region. Now, most of you have probably seen the promotional materials on the tables, postcards and flyers about the book. It's also available on Amazon, of course, and in bookstores everywhere. That's my little plug. Right now, I'm going to show you a video. And the video we're about to see provides a brief overview of 3 of the chapters in the book, one on black art in LA by Professor Paul von Bloom, another on the controversial closure of King Drew Medical Center by Assistant Director Anna Cristina Ramon and myself, and a final one on the history of the Solar music label that was hot in the 1980s by Scott Brown. This is just a sampling of some of the topics covered in the volume, which covers the period surrounding LA's founding in 1781 through its tremendous growth in the early 20th century to issues confronting black Angelenos in the present day. Black Los Angeles. American Dreams and Racial Realities is an edited anthology, 16 chapters that try to connect the dots between the past, the present, and the future of Black Los Angeles. So, we had 25 different contributors to our volume as well.
Well, my name is Paul von Bloom. I'm the author of one of the chapters in the upcoming book, Black LA. I've had the privilege of writing about the formation of African American visual art in Los Angeles. And the readers of Black LA, Black Los Angeles will see, the cover art is by the late artist Ernie Barnes. This is a picture of the late Ernie Barnes, but in the vibrant community of African American artists in the Los Angeles area, we have some of the men and women who are widely recognized not only nationally, but internationally as some of the major figures in visual art since the end of the Second World War. We have Dr. Samela Lewis, who in addition to being an extraordinarily fine visual artist, is probably the premier African-American art historian, and who was in fact my mentor over 30 years ago to bring me into the field of African-American art. Beyond the creativity of the individual artists alone, we've had a long and glorious history of institutions. We've had the California African American Museum. We've had the Museum of African American Art. We've had several African American art galleries, the Brockman Gallery. Now, at the moment, we have a major art gallery called the M. Hanks Gallery in Santa Monica. We've had cultural institutions like the Watts Tower Art Center. and several community organizations like the Black Photographers of California that have specialized in the African American visual tradition. All things considered, this is an extraordinarily vibrant community, both for its individual artists and for its institutional support. We have every reason to believe that this phenomenon will continue to prosper and grow, and I have every expectation as we move into the second decade of the 21st century that Los Angeles will increasingly be recognized as one of the great centers for African American visual art in North America.
I think the biggest surprise for me was the more things change, the more they stay the same. You know, you see issues arising in Black Los Angeles in the early days that people are still grappling with today, albeit in different guise. Obviously, times have changed, society has evolved, but many of the challenges that African Americans in Los Angeles faced in the early days we're still confronting today. Killing Killer King is a chapter that tells the story of the rise and fall of Martin Luther King Jr. Charles Arl Drew Medical Center. When King Drew opened its doors in 1972, it was really considered a model medical facility. Located near the Watts section of Los Angeles, the facility rose from the ashes of the infamous 1965 riots, a response by the power structure to the shameful absence of quality medical care for the poor Black community in the surrounding area. How this model medical facility eventually acquired the nickname of Killer King is a cautionary tale about race and politics in America. The hospital opened in 1972 as a symbol of Black pride and community control, but soon came to represent Black failure as report after report of incompetent doctors and nurses and fraudulent practices saturated the news media. At the core of our analysis is coverage of King Drew in Los Angeles' major newspaper, the Los Angeles Times, from the period leading up to the facility's celebrated opening in 1972 to its controversial closure in 2006. We attempt to flesh out the subtle and not so subtle ways in which racial framing shaped public perception of the hospital, specifically how it worked to divert attention away from other factors affecting the hospital's performance, thereby sealing its fate. A lot of it, we argue in our chapter, had to do with inadequate funding and really a structure that was set up from the very beginning to have problems. So part of what the book tries to do is to understand that interesting beginning and connect it to where we are today. Now, I think the reason they put me on this panel is because Hollywood actually plays a role. The industry and the media, shape our perception.
Chapter 11 of Black Los Angeles is entitled Solar, Sound of Los Angeles Records.
Now that label in this article is situated in the context of the great dominant labels, African-American owned labels like Motown, like Stax and others, but for a variety of reasons hasn't gotten necessarily the kind of historical recognition for such.
Solar, known as the Motown of the 80s, dominated R&B and pop music with a run of hits from a large roster of artists, including The Whispers, Shalimar, Lakeside, Midnight Star, Climax, Calloway, and Babyface. Solar flourished while in the midst of a major transformation in the history of African American music. The latter 1970s was not necessarily an opportune time for a startup Black record label, as major record companies had established Black music divisions aimed at gaining a foothold in African American consumer markets. The story of Solar is also grounded in the unique biography of its founder, Dick Griffey. By the time that Solar was launched, Dick Griffey had decades of experience in multiple facets of the music business. An important section in the story of Solar is related to the rise of Soul Train, an important television media expansion of African American music and culture.
Name? Ray.
Ray.
N-E-V-I-L.
So,
I have any Todd Boyd in your anthology?
he is mentioned, Ray. Name? Okay, now I'd like to turn the podium over to Vice Chancellor for Graduate Studies and Dean of the Graduate Division, Claudia Mitchell-Kernan. As she has done for several years now, she will say a few words about the history of the Thurgood Marshall Lecture Series. Claudia?
Thank you, Darnell. It's very much a pleasure to have the opportunity to join in welcoming distinguished guests and members of the UCLA community this evening. As one of the founders of the Thurgood Marshall Lecture on Law and Human Rights, it has been my honor to introduce these occasions with a little history about how the series actually came to be and why it has sustained itself for more than 2 decades, growing into a valued tradition within the UCLA community. When the lecture series originated in 1987, I was director of what was then called the Center for Afro-American Studies, now the Bunche Center. Henry McGee, a member of UCLA's law school, who had preceded me as center director, came to me with an urgent proposal. In 1987, Justice Marshall was still sitting on the Supreme Court, but he had already become a symbol of the great 20th century struggle to use the judicial system in the battle for civil rights, to turn the system of oppression into a mechanism of liberation. His major professional accomplishments were already the stuff of history books. However, the period when the courts were making courageous decisions championing civil rights had actually ended, and the social impact of those decisions was being eroded by opposing forces. McGee shared with me his concern that the significance of Marshall's achievements might be forgotten with time. While his strategies seemed to be losing their power, we reasoned the brilliance and passion and persistence of his struggle would always remain relevant. The result was this lecture series bearing Marshall's name, now more than 20 years old. We chose the title with care, using law and human rights rather than law and civil rights, because Justice Marshall's concerns for equity and justice knew no boundaries. As Solicitor General for President Lyndon B. Johnson, he served as a constitutional advisor to Kenya as that nation slipped the bonds of colonialism and established itself as an independent entity. The title also reflected our recognition that the fate of African Americans has an international context as well as a local one. Akin to the hierarchy of race and class at home, the United States has been one of the architects of an international system in which those who reap the benefits are mostly male, usually white, and often of European heritage. Much has changed in the 2 decades since the first Thurgood Marshall Lecture, and yet perhaps too little. Sadly, the courts have not returned to their role as path breakers on the long road to equity for all Americans, and it seems unlikely that they will do so in the decade to come. And while we have elected the first African American president, we have seen that change, the change that he promised, can be diluted and deferred, not only by the opposition party, but also by the very structures and institutions of government. The hierarchy of race and class has barely been rattled at home or abroad. On this occasion 2 years ago, I commented on what was then the possible election of the first African American president, a man who represented the combination of black and white and African and America, a man whose personal history was removed from the taints of slavery and segregation. I saw this as a possible sign of progress in the racial climate of our country. And while indeed we must acknowledge the advancements, we have far too much fresh evidence that the pernicious attitudes of the past remain to having considerable strength. At UCLA, the 40th anniversary of the Ethnic Studies Center's in 2009 offered an opportunity to assess where we've been and how far we've come. Clearly, the diversity of the campus has experienced a revolution. Among students, faculty, and staff, there is today a significant presence of people who were once only marginally visible. In addition, the body of research and literature the university generates has been enriched by the new directions we have taken and the new voices we hear. And yet, even as we gathered in the Fowler Museum this spring for the opening of an exhibit marking this anniversary, the conversation occasionally turned to an incident at UC San Diego that could only blunt our spirits. In addition, as we recall the courage and insight of the young people who created the revolution that brought ethnic studies to UCLA, we hoped our present practices would stimulate the emergence of similar qualities among today's young people, even if their strategies were far different. The man we honor this evening, Harry Edwards, belongs to the revolutionary generation of 1969. While he was still a student, Dr. Edwards founded the Olympic Project for Human Rights, encouraging Black athletes to boycott the 1967 Summer Olympics in Mexico City, or join in other protests. As they accepted their gold and bronze medals, 2 African American runners raised their fists in a Black Power salute. That image, disseminated in the press, became a symbol of protest and African American insurgents, and indeed it remains so. Joining the faculty at UC Berkeley in 1970 as a professor of sociology, Dr. Edwards devoted his career to studying Black student athletes and the connections among sports, education, and Black liberation. I must point out, however, that Dr. Edwards is now an emeritus professor. Like Henry McGee and so many others of that revolutionary period, many of his contributions are now the stuff of inspirational history. A new generation must answer the call to leadership, and that is why the Thurgood Marshall Lecture has become such a vital tradition. Until character once and for all triumphs color, Thurgood Marshall will remain a model for us, not only of the need to continue the struggle, but also of the dignity and energy and indeed success with which that battle can be waged. For those of us who are committed to the goal of equity for all, reviewing his legacy at this annual event offers the opportunity to acknowledge our progress and to reset our course. In the middle of the fray, the territory gained may be difficult to see, but it is nevertheless won, and it is from this new posture that we must go forward. Let us bear this in mind as we envision the new phases of our struggle and the issues and leadership which may take the center stage in the future. Thank you very much.
Good evening. My name is Walter Allen. I'm a professor of education and sociology. I am pleased and honored to have this opportunity to present to you Professor Harry Edwards. You've gotten a glimpse of, well, actually, he doesn't need or require introduction. We see in the program a very detailed and thorough examination of his accomplishments over a life that one has to say has been well lived. And we've heard from the 2 previous speakers recognitions of the works and accomplishments of Harry. What you come away with after reading this brief bio sketch and after studying a bit of his life is a summary of a life that has been guided by passion, purpose, and just a determination to pursue the good and be an active instrument of change. I spent some time thinking about how to make my very brief remarks about Harry. It must have been well over 30 years ago that I first met the good doctor. He was accomplished and very much esteemed in the field, but found time for those of us who were just beginning to move into the profession and trying to make our way. Harry, I thought a little bit about how I would characterize what you have accomplished, and came up with a model that, came up with a framing that summarized it in terms of three concepts: mentor, model, and master. Now, mentor in the sense of, as I've mentioned, serving as my own private mentor, but also over your years at Berkeley, teaching some of the most popular classes that the institution has ever witnessed. Fact is, the classes were so popular that there were elements in the university who were absolutely convinced that he wasn't really teaching a serious class. So they mounted what was basically a very thorough inquiry and examination of the class. And it turns out that it was one of the most rigorous classes that was being offered on the campus. But what drew students was that challenge to test their intellectual limits and to mobilize their minds and spirits in the business of trying to achieve positive social change. So mentor to a legion of students, undergraduates, graduates, and as well postgraduate students. Model, showing the kind of example of an activist scholar that was noted just a moment ago. It's very striking that the places that Harry passed through, either before or shortly after, had major movements. You know that iconic photo of Cornell with the students armed and on the steps of the hall there. We know, and again, an iconic vision or view that Dr. Mitchell-Kernan shared of the demonstration at the Olympics. So the point is that he's provided this model for us. And lastly, just master. Having mastered several careers, really, as a scholar athlete, as a professor, and as one of the earlier public intellectuals, although I've never heard him refer to himself as such. But really, if you look at the career, you see elements that very much speak to a determination to bring scholarship to a wider public and to have scholarly endeavor mean something in the lives of people and in everyday affairs of the society. Dr. Edwards will be speaking to us on the topic, The Fire This Time, the challenges of diversity in the second decade of the 21st century. So if you would join me in welcoming the good doctor, Brother Harry Edwards.
Thank you very much. Can you move that computer? You can just sit it on the edge down here. I won't step on it. All right. Thank you. Thank you all very much. Thank you all for your gracious introductions and remarks. If I were half as bright as those remarks would appear to indicate, I'd be smart enough to stop while I'm ahead. So in conclusion, let me I want to, before I begin, I would like to recognize my daughters who took time out to come out this evening, as Much as I've spoken at virtually every major university in this country. I've also been on TV numerous times giving talks, lectures, debates, everybody from William F. Buckley to Tom Brokaw to sports writers and journalists and so forth from all over the world. But it's very seldom that they have had an opportunity to hear me speak in person. My wife and I, Sandra, the last 41 years, going on 41 years, gave all of our children African names in order to honor and bear living witness to those African forebearers brought to this land in chains, but who through the dark centuries endured, persevered, and survived in the full faith that subsequent generations might one day emerge, not just to survive, not just to continue the struggle, but to prevail. So I would like to introduce my daughter, attorney Tazamisha Heshima Imara, the back. And I would, here in the middle, I would also like to introduce my daughter, Dr. Fatima Mullaney Imara. Thank you all very much for coming. My late mentor and friend, Coach Bill Walsh of the San Francisco 49ers used to say over the course of 5 Super Bowl championships that in football, the sport that most closely mirrors life, it is what we learn from our past mistakes that most assures future success. It is from the wisdom of this perspective that I take the theme for my address tonight, The Fire This Time. Over the course of my life and career as a scholar activist, I have found that the study of history is the effort that best rewards inquiry toward the end of understanding present circumstances and their trajectory going forward. Today, more than ever, we must understand at least our recent past as a people if we're going to have an informed conversation and dialogue, much less strategy, concerning where we are as a society and where we might be headed as a nation. There is a famous literary work which begins, "It was the best of times and it was the worst of times." If the truth be told, of course, it is always the best and the worst of times. All times on the grand scale of societal developments and the evolution of a nation are a mixture of joy and exasperation, of success and frustrated disappointment, of achievement and obstruction, of grief and glory. Confronted with such an aggregate reality, what should we be doing? What should be our focus today? What features of the social, cultural, and political landscape should command priority, interest, and attention? Our most reliable guide here can only be the lessons of the past. In this regard, if there is one book that I would direct you to, it would be The Fire Next Time by the brilliant novelist, short story writer, and essayist, the late James Baldwin. Though published some 48 years ago, The Fire Next Time speaks to us over the decades and provides a chilling illumination of some priority dynamics driving the urgency of our current and evolving circumstances. It also guides us toward, in some measure, toward the depth of commitment and the caliber of courage that will be needed if we are to institute and defend remedies capable of altering our present course and direction. It was 1962, following 8 years of effusive euphoria in the wake of Brown versus Board of Education, Topeka, Kansas, the Supreme Court decision striking down separate but equal as the law of the land. A new young Catholic president had been in office 2 years and had shown somewhat less of an affinity for accommodating Dixiecrat interest on civil rights issues. Expectations had become so elevated and exuberant that the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People had promulgated the slogan, "Free by 63." But Baldwin discerned another more complicated and troubling dynamic emerging in intergroup affairs. Put most simply, Baldwin had summarized that contradictions and problems at the interface of race and society, in the totality of their reality, were so deep-seated in their sources, so devastating in their contradictions and the scope of their consequences, that they threatened not only to derail the established civil rights movement and to dilute its relevance, but to redirect intergroup relations toward an ever more obstreperous, contentious, even violent course. A fate that was unavoidable in Baldwin's estimation, save by way of a fundamental shift in movement philosophy, strategies, and goals. You see, Baldwin understood that the civil rights movement from the 1950s into the early 1960s was largely a church-based, clergy-led, race-driven, black middle-class oriented movement, targeting racial segregation, particularly in the South. In the North, the Midwest, and the West, while race was still a major demarcating feature in human relations, class was looming as an ever-increasing influence on black life chances and prospects in the traditional black community, particularly as the black middle class migrated out of the community in pursuit of increasing integration-generated opportunities. While most urban black people in the North, in the Midwest, and in the West had supported the civil rights movement, and many had participated directly in it by some means or measure, while they had seen the civil rights movement struggle broadcast on their TV sets and had read about its successes and achievements in their newspapers, they had all too often seldom seen its direct positive impact within their own urban communities. In fact, what was becoming increasingly evident was that there was occurring a precipitous and ongoing deterioration in black community institutions and functional viability as the black middle class exited, taking with them their value set, their organizational, entrepreneurial, and strategic leadership skills, their network of community, social, cultural, and political associations, their money, and their broader urban presence and influence. Substantially left out and left behind, traditional black communities in far too many instances fell into deepening institutional disarray, instability, and dysfunction, while the people historically served by those institutions faced rising desperation and even hopelessness. Over time, for many in this population, access to the American mainstream would inevitably drift farther and farther beyond the horizon of perceived possibility, and the American dream would seem even more alien, remote, and unachievable than it was before desegregation. This was Baldwin's vision of civil rights developments, while the civil rights establishment and the American liberal mainstream more generally celebrated what was broadly defined and accepted as the integration movement's unmitigated trajectory of achievement and advancement. In fact, the civil rights leadership of the day and its mainstream sponsors and supporters were so at odds with some of Baldwin's views that they wouldn't allow him to speak at the 1963 March on Washington. Not least upsetting of Baldwin's perspectives was the concluding paragraph of his book, where he wrote these prophetic lines: "If we do not change course, if we do not dare everything, the fulfillment of that prophecy recreated in song by a slave is upon us." And God gave Noah the rainbow sign: no more water, the fire next time. In terms of modern day application and parlance, his reference was clear. Notwithstanding civil rights successes, and in some part precisely because of the character of those successes, we were approaching a day when many among the black masses would no longer be nonviolently tolerant, patient in the face of fire hoses and water cannons turned on black people in opposition to their just pursuit of their civil and human rights. By daring everything, Baldwin meant that everybody counts, that all civil and human rights are indeed indivisible, that it was not enough to just declare that injustice anywhere is injustice everywhere, that we could no longer put forth strategies, pursue goals, and institute programs that selectively created opportunities for some, while consigning others deliberately or by unintentional collateral outcomes to the ranks of the undeserving, the unqualified, the disqualified, and ultimately the dispossessed. The interests and issues of all historically excluded groups must be in the mix, on the table, and included in the goals and strategies of the struggle. By the time of the March on Washington in 1963, Baldwin was being resoundingly reviled and dismissed as a wild-eyed contrarian, as an alarmist, and as a crank, as someone lost in the corridors of his own mind, perhaps confused and confounded over his dual minority status as a gay black man. So, though he was the most heralded and noted black protest writer of the day, he was not allowed to speak at the march, as was also the case, by the way, with Bayard Rustin, who organized the March on Washington. But Bayard Rustin, you see, like James Baldwin, was openly gay. And other black movement leaders, good Christians that they were, did not want to send the wrong message, as one of the leaders stated, by allowing an openly gay black man to speak. This was a confluence of religious orthodoxy, movement ideology, and outright bigotry that reverberates to this day in black communities across this nation. A confluence that has contributed mightily to why so many otherwise progressive black Americans today are confused, conflicted, misinformed, and misguided on gay issues, and inordinately supportive of such travesties of freedom and justice as Proposition 8. And I know some of you don't agree with this, but right is still right when nobody is right. And wrong is still wrong, even if everybody is wrong. Over ensuing years, the perception of Baldwin as a contrarian and a crank seemed at least plausible. The Civil Rights Act passed in 1964. The Voting Rights Act passed in June of 1965. But then in August of 1965, the black community of Watts exploded in a firestorm of urban inner city rebellion. As early as 1964, we had already seen the emergence of Malcolm X, the cultural political godfather of a new wave of militancy. By 1966, there was Huey Newton and branches of the Black Panther Party being established in black communities throughout the West, the Midwest, and the Northeast. H. Rap Brown and Stokely Carmichael adopted a more radical strategy of militant stance for the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, which increasingly came to be referred to simply as SNCC, since it was increasingly neither nonviolent in its rhetoric nor its temperament, and was more engaged in organizing black communities in pursuit of black power than in organizing black students toward integrationist goals and in the role of integrationist foot soldiers. And there was a growing list of other new and transformed organizations, too numerous to cite, that in frustration broke with established civil rights doctrine and direction. There also were other influences exacerbating the climate of black frustration and alienation. What Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. referred to as the forces of nullification and interposition fanned the flames of violent reaction in the face of hard-won civil rights advances. As early as 1963, Medgar Evers had been murdered. 4 little black girls had been killed in a church bombing, and countless other violent acts were perpetrated against black communities, black churches, and black people. And the young president who had offered so much hope had been assassinated. In the wake of these and similar developments, James Baldwin was eventually hailed as a modern-day prophet, and The Fire Next Time was enshrined as one of the classics of black protest literature. How then do we gauge our circumstances today against this background and understanding of our recent history, our experiences and outcomes over the last half of the 20th century? As was the case at the onset of the 1960s, America has a new young president who had the audacity to incite and initiate a new dawn of hope and elevated expectation. Along with an African-American family in the White House, we have what is arguably the most progressive Democratic majority in the history of the United States Congress. We have an African-American in the all-important chief law enforcement position of Attorney General, and even a wise Latina on the United States Supreme Court. We have, for the first time in U.S. history, a city, a predominantly white middle and upper middle class city, Newton, Massachusetts, which through popular election voted in the majority for an African-American mayor, an African-American governor, and an African-American president. On top of it all, we have the largest black middle class in American history, while the experts tell us that on the average, African Americans have made significant strides in closing the income and education gaps with the white mainstream. These realities, as laudable, even as exhilarating and spiritually and politically affirming as they are, for too many of us blur and obstruct recognition of a far less comforting complexity and a bunch of counter-intuitive realities. First, in the real world, where the best of times and the worst of times so often are commingled and coexist, in coexistence, the average outcomes are all too often the least meaningful of measures in the evaluation of circumstances. So I told somebody earlier today, as the great humorist Mark Twain once stated, if you take a man and put one of his feet in a bucket of ice and the other one in a pot of boiling water, on the average, he ought to be pretty comfortable. Today, we can no longer afford to play the on the average scorecard. So paralleling the gap closing averages and portraits of progress are the dynamics of increasing frustration, deprivation, alienation, and rage within urban black communities. A situation further fueled by talk of a post-racial society, even in the face of vitriolic, often blatantly racist rhetoric and demonstrations. And there is no denying that the rage in the traditional black community is justified. While from 2008 to the present, America has been experiencing the most devastating economic times in almost 80 years, the economic conditions of urban black communities have approximated these conditions and worse at least since the recession of the late 1980s, driving increasing numbers of people, particularly young black males, to ever greater reliance upon the underground and the underworld economies. So the 15.1% black unemployment rate that is so widely reported today, a figure grossly exceeding the national average, is really a very conservative estimation, since so many blacks either never were or are no longer even looking for jobs in the mainstream economy. In fact, in many urban areas, the real black unemployment rate is probably closer to 35%. With no vision of hope or inclusion in the economic mainstream, too many black youths in particular value on education has diminished. This, in combination with poorly resourced, deteriorating urban educational institutions overall, has resulted in black student dropout rates that are approaching 40% nationally, with many school districts experiencing even higher rates. This situation, of course, has led to greater black involvement with the criminal justice system, particularly in regard to black males who are not only more likely to drop out, but to be suspended from school. In California, nearly 50% of black males do not finish high school, and over a quarter of black males 15 to 34 years of age are under the control of the courts, either under suspicion, under investigation, under indictment, under arrest, on bail, incarcerated, on probation, or on parole. And California is not exceptional. In my home state of Illinois, black youth over the last decade have been 50% of the youths arrested and 55.2% of the youths incarcerated. For drug-related crimes in this state, where statistics suggest that white youth sell and use drugs at least at the same rate, and in some jurisdictions at higher rates, 59% of the youths arrested and 88% of the youths incarcerated for drug-related crimes are black, while 85.5% of youths tried as adults in Illinois are black. In Louisiana, another state, just to show you the breadth of this problem, where only a third of the state youths are black, blacks account for 78% of the young people confined to correctional facilities. Nationally, black males are more likely to be arrested if suspected, adjudicated if arrested, convicted or plea bargained if adjudicated, incarcerated if convicted, and executed if condemned. For so many among the populations in traditional black communities and in our urban centers, particularly young black males, neither the civil rights past nor the hopeful present constitute the best of times. For them, far from being times of exhilarating hope and rising expectations, these are times of mass incarceration, ugly demonization, and outright criminalization and death. Circumstances that are even more devastating, since prisons are essentially schools and universities for instruction in crime, all abetted by a lack of opportunities once they leave prison. The institutional and individual dysfunction is abetted by ongoing racism and class bias, in combination with developments in the wake of civil rights successes and negative collateral outcomes. All of this has generated a state of undeclared war in our urban cities, particularly among our young black men. By way of illustration, consider that over the first 5 years of the Iraq and Afghanistan wars, a combined total of just under 5,000 Americans of all races, ethnicities, and genders lost their lives in combat from all manner of weaponry, with just over 32,000 being wounded. Over that same 5-year period, Based upon CDC statistics on black male homicides by gunfire alone, over 27,000 black males were killed, largely in urban America and at the hands of other frustrated, rage-filled black males, meaning that the unconscionable and literally unacceptable reality is that over the 5-year period of the Iraq and Afghanistan wars, a black male living in one of our urban centers was over 5 times more likely to be killed in the streets of his own community than he would have been to die fighting a war in the streets of Baghdad or Kabul, and nearly 10 times as likely to be wounded. When combined with the epidemics of obesity, drug addiction, AIDS, and other poverty and lifestyle-related urban afflictions, this violence constitutes an urban public health crisis that no amount of health care, reform, or guaranteed health insurance coverage is likely to abate. They are again being left out. And there is still more blowback from the tragedies, from the strategies, methods, and goals of our past civil rights struggles for all that we accomplished and given all of our best intentions. We not only failed to be sufficiently inclusive to challenge the class-based circumstances that people in our inner cities and urban centers faced, we even assumed that in dealing with the race issue, we also would resolve the contradictions of gender within the race. That is, when gender issues were considered to be significantly important to be brought up at all. The tendency was to neglect the clearly evident facts that what was happening to black women then as now, as often as not, happens to them not just because they're black, but because they are women. And secondly, that black men were not going anywhere, that black women did not go as full, equal, and participating partners. It is with both chagrin and embarrassment that we should look back upon the height of the civil rights movement and realize that not only was there not a single one of the so-called Big Five major civil rights organizations headed by a woman, but the only woman allowed to make a presentation from the podium of the March on Washington was Mahalia Jackson, who was allowed to sing a hymn. When Dorothy Haight, God rest her soul, president of the National Council of Negro Women and the largest and most influential organization headed by a woman, asked to speak, she was denied. We simply ignored the admonition of the poet who wrote of the black woman, when and where I enter, so enters the entire race. I'm not picking on the March on Washington and its leaders. What they did was outstanding, but it was cast as the great coming together, the unity forum of the day, with civil rights leaders, unions, movie stars, government officials, artists, and activists of every progressive stripe. But look at what was overlooked. We can't afford to make those mistakes again. Today, the complexity of circumstances and challenges that we face are greater than ever, most certainly greater than what we faced during the height of the civil rights movement of the 50s and 60s and early 70s. The expanding diversity of our cities has generated this increased stakes and compounded the difficulties of challenges as Latinos, Asian Americans, newer immigrant populations, and people driven from the suburbs back into the urban centers by skyrocketing energy prices and collapsed housing markets compete for space, jobs, housing, and institutional access. This ever greater diversity of cultures aspirations, expectations, and interest has moved the challenges we now face far beyond those traditionally associated with race, class, and gender. Again, if we have learned anything from the past, it is that these challenges cannot be selectively managed piecemeal. For example, today both Latinos and blacks, as would be expected, enter college in numbers far below students from other groups, and nearly 60% drop out before graduation. But because of their rapidly increasing numbers relative to college-aged youths of other groups, a situation emerges where lower rates of college enrollment and competition and college completion by black and Latino students mean that American college graduation rates overall will go down. Because of age group density alone, over the next decade, the educational pipeline will have to open to larger numbers of black and Latino students. If we have not prepared them and if we cannot educate them, our fate as a nation in the arena of global economic, scientific, and other competitions is sealed, because our student base, the group of young people, the cohort of college-age students upon whom we must depend, their groups have not been included in our strategies going forward. Now more than ever, we must heed to include everybody, because for better or for worse, everybody counts. Based upon the last election results, the majority of Americans want to move forward. They want to move on. The problem is that even some of the best intentioned of our fellow citizens, some of our most progressive fellow citizens, want to take all of their baggage with them. So when we fight for full rights and opportunities for women, when we fight for full rights and opportunities for gays, when we fight for full rights and opportunities of all of the people in our urban centers, we are fighting for ourselves. We're fighting the struggle of the 21st century to carry on the struggle. We need to stop talking about illegal aliens as if the people who attend our schools, who work our fields, who clean our hotels, and who work in our hospitals are somehow from another planet. We most certainly must secure our borders, particularly in this age of terrorism, drug cartels, and human trafficking. But we must, with equal urgency and fervor, begin judiciously and expeditiously and compassionately to address the burdens and circumstances of Americans with undocumented parents, spouses, children, and relatives, of undocumented taxpayers, of undocumented soldiers defending this nation, and so forth. We need to stop talking about illegal aliens. We do less at our peril, not to speak of leaving open opportunities for such draconian, ill-conceived, ill-advised, and unjust developments as what we have witnessed in Arizona, where a state law allows police to stop people who the officer has a reasonable suspicion might be undocumented, while claiming that no racial or ethnic profiling is involved. I'll leave it to the lawyers and constitutional experts to determine if the law passes constitutional muster. But until somebody explains to me how reasonable suspicion can involve anything other than racial and ethnic profiling, this law most certainly doesn't pass the sniff test. It doesn't pass the straight face test. How can anybody who is sane and serious claim that such a law is not based on profiling and keep a straight face? And if they legally get to the place that they can undertake profile stops of Latinos today in search of undocumented aliens, there is nothing to stop movement eventually to legally profile and stop blacks in search of gangbangers, or to stop Arab Americans in search of undocumented immigrants and terrorists. And for those who think that it could never come to that, let me inform you of something. It will have come to that already the first time that an officer stops a Latino in Arizona under this law. It will have already come to that. So as we enter the second decade of the 21st century, if history teaches us anything, it is that a fire this time is inevitable. The diversity and urgency of the challenges we face will either propel this nation to hitherto unprecedented heights of purpose, possibility, and productivity, or it will drag us down into an ever-deepening spiral of social, political, and economic chaos toward a national nervous breakdown. Will the fire next time be a prairie fire of progressive movement based on inclusion, or yet another firestorm of violence and unrest fueled by competing interest, desperation, and rage? Put most simply, we are now compelled to seek seriously and to earnestly resolve the riddle of this nation's national motto, E pluribus unum, from many, one, not in pursuit of some abstract, noble sentiment, but in programmatic recognition that inclusion is not only a prerequisite to progress, to achieving the just and equitable society, but it has now become a prerequisite to national stability, viability, and institutional integrity. And as for those who might think that to dare everything, to dare to include everybody in our strategies, in our movements, in our struggle, is to dare too much, I would direct you to page 108 of The Fire Next Time, where even Baldwin, for all of his vision and perspective, castigates someone who dared to affirm a potential scenario and course of possibility that Baldwin considered so naively optimistic, so outrageous and presumptuous as to be patronizing to black people. It was 1962, and the person in question was then Attorney General Bobby Kennedy. His statement was this: if we keep the faith and continue the effort, a Negro can become President of the United States in 40 years. When asked why he believed that, he responded, why not? He missed it by a mere 6 years. So when, in the back of your mind, you ask Edwards, how can everyone be included in a movement? We have interest groups. We have different needs. Many of us are moving in different directions. How can the interest of everyone be part of the discussion and included in our strategies and in our goals? Why do you think something like that is even possible? My response is, why not? Thank you very much. I appreciate your attention.
One more time, Professor Harry Edwards. Okay, before we wrap up this evening, I'd like to invite to the podium one of our really successful and promising young scholars who's a student in the master's program in African American Studies for a special presentation. Takesha Brennan.
Good evening. The Ralph Bunche Center for African American Studies at UCLA proudly presents this award to Harry Edwards for his scholarship, activism, and commitment to social change, and for delivering the keynote address for the 21st Annual Thurgood Marshall Lecture on Law and Human Rights on April 29, 2010. Harry Edwards.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Thank you. Appreciate it. Thank you. Thank you.
Well, another year, another Thurgood Marshall Lecture, another inspirational address. I want to thank you again, Professor Edwards, for accepting our invitation. We're really inspired by your words this evening. Before we leave, I have a few thank yous. I want to thank the Bunche Center staff, as always, for working diligently to put this event together. Bunche Center staff. I'd also like to thank all of the others who have worked over the last few months to help us organize this event. Your contributions have been instrumental as well. Before we leave, we showed you the blurb earlier about the Black LA book. Wanted to draw your attention to an event we have coming up at the Bunche Center, May 25th, from 1:30 p.m. till 6, Royce 314. We have a Black LA symposium. We've invited scholars from around the country to come out and talk about the various sections of the book. The first section of the book is called Space. It deals with the geography of black people in LA from the very beginning to the present. The second section is on people, on different groups of people who face particular challenges in Black LA history. The third section is on image, that is to say how Black LA is viewed from afar, but as well from within. And the last section is called Action. What do we do about it? So we're bringing people to come out and talk about the various sections. We're hoping to have a really stimulating dialogue and think about ways to move forward. So we invite you to join us. And of course, thank you all for attending. Your presence makes the evening special. Please drive safely and see you next year.